Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for tuning into the Cloud Native FM podcast. You are listening to the host, Saim, co founder of the Cloud Native Islamabad community and the organizer of the very first KCD Pakistan 2023 happening in Islamabad next month. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, regardless of where you are or watching us from, or listening to me, or watching me, or listening to me, listening to the recording. Very, very warm welcome to the show. A show which brings the latest and greatest news from the CNCF ecosystem to help you keep up to speed with what's going on and where you need to be focused on more and where you meet the brave mind and awesome community member, co-founder of the most vast open source project of 2023. And today is 24th January, and tomorrow is my birthday. And I'm celebrating today with some of the most respectful community member and co-founder of the most demanding open source projects. So without further delay, let me go straight to my first guest. Jesse Suen is one of the creator of or lead for the Argo project. He is a co-founder and CTO of the Equity, which provides cloud-native application delivery powered by Argo. Prior to founding Equity, Jesse was principal software engineer at Ituit and the technical lead for the Argo team. Very, very warm welcome to the show, Jesse.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. So next, another big guest. Jim is a co-founder of the CEO, co-founder and the CEO of Nirmata, who are in turn the founder of Kyverno. Kyverno is a policy engine designed for Kubernetes. With Kyverno, policies are managed as Kubernetes resources, and no new language is required to write policies. This allows using familiar tools such as kubectl, Git, and Customize to manage policies. Kyverno policies can validate, mutate, and generate Kubernetes resources. Welcome to the show again, Jim.
Thank you, Sam. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, and early happy birthday to you.
Thank you very much, Jim. And another guest is a Crossplane lets you automate creation of infrastructure using Kubernetes API. And Daniel Magnum is a Crossplane maintainer working at its creator Upbound, a former tech lead for Kubernetes SIG release and as YouTube streaming star. Today, he will be providing us some wonderful insight on infrastructure as code, control plane to building a control plane for control plane and composition. Welcome to the show, Daniel, on the Cloud Native FM podcast.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much. So let's start about some discussion around. So, and the last guest is me, who's talking about Paralus. And let me quickly give you some brief intro of newly added CNCF sandbox project. Secure kubectl access to remote cluster from anywhere with using Paralus is having a Paralus is using just-in-time service account creation and user-level credential management integrated with your organization RBAC SSO solution. And without we start the discussion, let me a big shout out to the Victor Farsik, the winner of DevOps Dozen Award, for helping me connect to these guests and talk. If we are talking in a minute, and encourages me to start a show with a theme like this. What if you can manage the deployment of all your Kubernetes cluster with Kubernetes? What if you can provide a single control plane for all of your cluster and external resources? What if you could automatically enforce best practices to enable self-service, following GitOps principle and enforcing policy standards and compliance with just-in-time service account creation and user-level credentials management integrated with the organization RBAC SSO solution? So now it's the time to ask some question. So I'm going straight to the Jesse. So, Jesse, what was the background story and the problem had that caused you to want to solve with the project we now known as the Argo, and who has given this name?
Yeah. So I'll start with the last question first about the Argo, the name. So if you don't know, Argo is the name of a ship in Greek mythology, which transported the Greek hero Jason and his Argonauts, which was the name of his crew, on his quest for the Golden Fleece. But it actually has another meaning. So Argonauts are a species of octopus, and so the name kind of fit well. And I have to give credit to Pratik for for coming up with that name. I didn't have anything to do with it. Anyways, so when we started Argo, it was actually this big monolith that we created at this my previous startup called Apodix, and it was trying to do everything. It was trying to do application deployment delivery. There was CI component to it. There was even like a cost analysis piece, and that product actually didn't resonate. I think it was like too big. So we actually decided to break it down into smaller components, and we started with what is now known as workflows. And so in fact, we actually stripped it down away from CI/CD specifically into the workflow engine and to be this general purpose component. And then we were planning to just build CI on top of that. Um, so um, I kind of like to think of it as kind of two stories, kind of the workflow side of things and then the CD side of things. So Argo workflows started because we stripped down this big monolith to just this kind of CI engine. But then when we got acquired by Intuit, and we were tasked to solve the CD problem. They had decided to start exploring and migrating to Kubernetes, but didn't have a deployment solution for that. And so the Platex team, part of us were just tasked, okay, go, figure out a solution for CD for Kubernetes. So we built it for ourselves, and we surveyed what was out there, and knowing what we knew about Kubernetes and its YAML and declarative aspects, we knew GitOps would be the right approach for us. Also, as a fintech company, there's just a lot of things that attracted us about GitOps, like the audit record, using Git as a audit history, change management through pull requests, and so it fit really well with with the things we were looking for. But yeah, when we surveyed what was out there, we knew the way we wanted to run our clusters, like we wanted it to be a tool that was multi-cluster, because we wanted to run lots of medium-sized clusters rather than like a huge cluster. Intuit's like 4,000 developers, so we knew we had to break it, run a lot of clusters. Things like SSO and RBAC were missing, so all of these kind of factored into the product in the begin with, and so that's how we just kind of took all those requirements, that's what came up to be ArgoCD.
Yes, thanks for the very quick intro of about how the Argo started. And another question before we go to the gem on some of the Kyverno thing. What was the main reason that Argo is now many separated projects?
Yeah. So like I mentioned, there's originally it wasn't. It was like this big monolith, but philosophically, I mean, I think I learned a lot from that original approach. But philosophically now, like when things can be broken up into standalone components, I think you should. And in fact, it's interesting because Argo rollouts. So once we built out the CD solution, one of the next problems was actually a lot of our developers were used to doing blue-green deployments, and even their applications were written in such a way that it had to be blue-green deployments, like meaning maybe there's API inconsistencies that they need to be to maintain when they upgrade, or the way they just test. So rollouts was came along after ArgoCD in response to solving blue green and canary deployments they were getting with like Spinnaker. So we originally actually tried to shoehorn that capability into ArgoCD. We thought, okay, like ArgoCD is a deployment tool. It should be able to do blue green. But I think when we really thought about it, I always describe ArgoCD as a glorified kubectl apply, and it was actually, it didn't feel as natural to kind of fit it into that component because and we tried to do some imperative stuff. We tried to do with Jenkins, the deployment kind of like a scripted approach, and finally we decided to start another project, Argo Rollouts, to just focus on the blue green and canarying, and I think it was the right decision. There's a lot of people out there who use rollouts without CD, CD without rollouts, and it kind of I think without separating all those things, things become too big for adoption. I think it enables people to just take the pieces that they need and deploy that. So yeah, so there's a little bit of philosophically, I think things can be, if they can be broken down, it probably should be broken down.
Yes, I think it's like a Unix philosophy, like do one
Yeah.
thing and do one thing and do one thing well, and combine as the need grow, as the problem grows, as the use case grows. So I think it's a great for the community to have all those tools. You can combine those to get the best result. So now I go to the gym, but with that, but there's another host with me today is Dan. Dan, any other question that you try to ask Jesse?
No, I don't think so. I actually we definitely use Argo, and lots of Crossplane users use Argo. And I like the framing as a glorified kube control apply, and I feel like that folks might take that as a making it seem diminutive, right? Like it's not doing a lot, but in contrast, I actually think that is illustrative of how compatible it is with other tooling, which is definitely something we can chat about when we get to Crossplane. But that standardization on the Kubernetes API and saying, hey, if it works with kube control apply, it's going to work with ArgoCD. I think that's actually a power of it rather than a minimization of the functionality.
Yeah, I agree. I think compatibility standards is kind of always also been front and center. Another kind of thing we were able to do was so when we were building out ArgoCD, Intune had like their own kind of identity and login stuff. It was, some of it was like very custom, but then we were able to say like, no, let's stick to standards. Let's stick to the OIDC, and we're an open source project. We can't do kind of bespoke kind of integrations, and so we always kind of use that as an excuse, but or like just yeah, sticking with just standard integrations is also kind of, I think, what we also kind of strive for.
That's awesome. I didn't actually know I was a host coming into this, but I guess I will take that role because he's back. But I think we are going to jump over to Jim next. If you want to go ahead and jump into talking a little about Kyverno.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and similar to, I think what Jesse shared, and it's interesting. So I think Sam has done a good job of picking different projects which share this common theme, right? Because it's interesting as an industry. We've talked about composable architectures and composable system for a while, but it's only now that with CNCF projects, with Kubernetes as the core engine, it's coming together, right? Because we have pieces like ArgoCD, Crossplane, Kyverno, and others being able to work together in this seamless manner, everything going through common structured APIs, which, if you think about the scale of CNCF and how many projects are there, it's amazing. It's mind boggling to think about engineering at that scale. And it's so much greater than what one single product or one single project may be able to deliver, right? So we started at Nirmata also kind of looking at the problem much like Jesse was describing with his prior startup, of Kubernetes management in a broader sense, right? And what we zeroed in on is to say, to make Kubernetes successful. And my background, I come from a software engineering background in the telecom space. So writing kind of like C++ code for base stations and cellular telephony. You learn about HA systems and real time systems in a different manner, and what we always thought about, but a lot of our founding team is also from that space. So we thought about, in those domains, policies were always front and center, and digital policies tend to codify concerns from different groups. Like in our space, of course, it's developers, security teams, operations teams. And if you can somehow codify and capture the intent of these different teams, and then have controllers apply those in a seamless manner, then it's magic, right? Because you can bring together all these varying constraints, you can operate at in a lights out manner, which is what we expect in these real time mission critical type of systems. And arguably, software today is that, right? We can't live. Just imagine life without software. We can't do anything in our day to day, whether it's our personal lives or work lives, etc. Right? So that's kind of starting with that and looking at, well, how do we solve policy for Kubernetes, and why not leverage Kubernetes itself to be able to do that in a declarative, a structured approach, using the same set of primitives and focusing on, solving this problem in a very elegant manner without, introducing too much complexity for the space, right? So I love the analogy of, just fitting into kubectl apply, and it's something again in engineering where um, you know uh, Kubernetes is complex, right? What we're solving in the domain, it's a set of very complex problems. But solving it in a, if you create a complex solution to solve a complex problem, you haven't really achieved much, right? You solve the problem, but it's still complex to use. But solving that in a simple manner where it's elegant, and a lot of the complexity is hidden from the end user. To me, that's what kind of came to mind when Jesse mentioned making it fit into kubectl apply, right? And Daniel, like you rightly said, that's not a bad thing. It's actually solving a very set of complex problems in an elegant manner where this sort of stuff is invisible to users, but it's still doing some very powerful things behind the scenes, right? So similarly, our focus is at Nirmata is for unified governance. Kyverno being the policy engine, which implements that with native policies that sit as Kubernetes resources, and also policy reporting becoming extremely easy, extremely usable through Kubernetes APIs, right? So working with the policy working group and a few other teams within Kubernetes, we are proposing that as a KEP where we standardize the APIs for policy reporting. So any tool, and today we have about almost a dozen different adapters already using the same policy reporting API that came out of Kyverno. And now once it becomes more of a standard, other tools can leverage this as well, right? So the goal is to make that easy and seamless, and continue this drive towards composable systems using these CNCF building blocks.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for the wonderful intro. So, a quick question regarding uh, can I create a Kyverno policy may be used to prevent a developer from deploying a database via Crossplane to a production environment that does not meet compliance requirement such as automated backups or high availability?
Yes. So the pattern we're starting to see emerge, and it seems like in 2023, everybody's talking about platform engineering all of a sudden, right? And now, the kind of instead of DevOps or DevSecOps, suddenly platform engineering has become that new term that's being adopted. But it's a very interesting thing where now you're treating platform as product. And the reason why that's relevant to your question is what we're seeing is these platform teams can now again capture these patterns using things like crossplane compositions and say, here's the type of database I want to allow in my service catalog, right? In my backstage or whatever I'm using. And when somebody clicks on that, there's policies to check at every layer of your system, starting from your CI/CD pipeline to the application sets and things like that that could be applied in ArgoCD to which even some of this may run in a management cluster which is maintaining the state. But then you might have certain resources being created in tenant clusters. So if you have hundreds or even thousands of clusters, you need policies across both of these roles. And when a developer or a team requests a database, like let's say an RDS database or something else, it needs to comply with your organizational standards. So because the beauty of Crossplane is everything's again a Kubernetes resource, much like with ArgoCD and how it does CI/CD. So Kyverno policies can be seamlessly applied to those, and it just works really well in terms of both being able to check and validate. But as you know, Kyverno also helps significantly with automation. So you can automate a lot of these concerns and create these type of in-cluster workflows, like a tighter control loop for certain resources which are created when a namespace is created, or when a cross-plane composition is created. You can even generate or mutate other resources as required.
Yes, absolutely. I think having a combination of Kyverno with the Crossplane is really shine, because all the dev and the ops team need those kind of uh, policies in place, unless they have to deal every situation hard codedly, and that's not feasible in the production system. So as the Jim says during the discussion, like the Kyverno has a policy reporter, and now I ask Jesse, do you think, like, if the policy reporters exist, how Argo CD can work with those policy report, or
Mm.
the vice versa? Like how Kyverno, how Argo CD can use those policy reports?
Um, yeah, that's actually a good question, because one of the things I've been really trying to push in the last year and a half, was the extending Argo CD. So we always envision Argo CD as something developers would be visiting on a day-to-day basis, because they want to look at their app, they're troubleshooting their apps, they're looking at their logs, understanding the health, and but Argo CD can't do everything, and so going um, down the scene, we built in mechanisms, what we call like Argo CD extension mechanisms, that allow you to, in fact, extend the user interface of Argo CD. You basically add a tab in different points, like if you're looking at the app, or if you're looking at your project, or if you're even we have system level extension, but essentially allow developers to customize their Argo CD interface and show a new UI element. So the flagship extension that we have right now is the Argo Rollouts extension. I mentioned Argo Rollouts as a separate standalone project, but it actually integrates really well with Argo CD, because when you right click or when you click the drop down on the rollout, you get all these actions, and you can pause a rollout or resume it or promote it. And so these are all they come with Argo CD, but they were built as a custom, what we call resource customization. So by that same token, the UI is also extensible, and the next thing we did was we built a rollout UI extension. So now when you go to the look at a rollout, you have to install the extension, by the way. But once you install the extension, you can click on the rollout open it and see a rollout specific tab, and it shows you like your canary steps. And so now going back to Kyverno reports and policies, the same could be done with a Kyverno report. You can, if YAML is not the way you like to see things and you want to present it in a more visual manner, then write some React code that can organize it more beautifully, and then you install that plugin, and from your ArgoCD application page, you can click on the Kyverno report and see it a lot nicer. So yeah, those type of things, like we want, Crossplane health checks is another one. Like, so Crossplane has kind of a custom conditions, right, that tell you the status of your resources. So if you want to know if like one of your Crossplane resources is not in sync or something, you can write a health check for that, and then in your ArgoCD interface, it'll show up, degraded. So those are the kind of things you can do. Some people aren't aware of these capabilities, but it's something I always mention whenever I get the chance.
Yes, absolutely. These are the really powerful capabilities, and these are not those things that not people talk about often. But I think these people are looking for the tools to combine those, and I think this is a show for them to understand. Like, these are the use cases you can address those. But before going to the Dan, because Dan, I have some very good questions, and he can get on some opinion. So here's my question for the Jim. So Jim, we have a policy. There is a library for the Kyverno policy, but I'm working with a project called Paralus. And what the Paralus is give you, let's say I am a dev person and the Jim is an ops person. So I need only access to, let's say, orange namespace, but Jim has all the access in the Kubernetes cluster. So when Jim log into the Paralus dashboard, he can see all the namespaces, all the cluster, everything. But I don't able to see the namespaces that the Jim acquired, because I have access to the namespaces that I can see. So now, as a user, you can create custom roles for your organization, and you can make them publicly available for, let's say, Jesse and Dan.
Right.
And they can use the same library to solve the same issue that we are solving. So how this library can be integrated with Kyverno?
Yeah, so one of the features coming in Kyverno 1.10 is the ability to provide extensions through service API calls, right? So in prior releases, Kyverno is able to call the API server. So anything that can be expressed as a Kubernetes resource, you could use that in a policy decisions. But to go beyond that, and some of the use cases we're looking at is like things like OpenCost or things like Prometheus. How do you leverage data from these systems in policy decisions as well? And which could be, also a library which is providing some access control data, which says, okay, should this be user allowed to do this operation itself, right? So Kyverno, starting with 1.10, will allow those type of extensions to be built in and run natively. And we will also add the CLI support, of course, if you're running this in a CI/CD pipeline. Another use case for this is, in the software supply chain security space, Kyverno 1.10 will have support for Notary V2 as in addition to the cosign 6 store support. And when that lands, that will, there are some use cases which we will be addressing through this extension mechanism as well.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, absolutely. And one customer, the Jesse, and the final one before we go to the Dan, is, let's say the Argo is actually requiring some access to the different namespaces to sync some kind of configuration state, desired and actual state model. But sometimes somebody is not an issue with the Argo, but the issue with the cluster admin or the people who set up the Argo CD pipeline. He give access to the resources to the Argo that has nothing to do with the repository. So let's say repository namespace net Orange is dedicated to the GitHub, and GitHub can sync to the Orange namespace and can see the synchronization data between uh, requests coming in and coming out from that repository. But let's say it's give access to the different namespace rather some different namespace. But do you think like some tools like who has some kind of restriction not give access to the things that they can require? How ArgoCD can leverage, let's say, some of those tools like Paralus, Kyverno, you talk about it, and some other exists in the RBAC system. So is there a way that the Argo can work with, or Argo has some kind of a rollback mechanism as of today? If not, how people can use those other tools that has RBAC support and integrate Argo CD with it?
Yeah, it's actually I'm glad you asked this because one thing people, so the default installation mode, like when you install Argo, is like it gives like essentially God mode privileges to itself, right? When you install Argo, because it doesn't know what it needs to deploy. Like, so the default set of permission is like, okay, it's star star star, but that it doesn't have to be the case. In fact, you can customize the RBAC entirely when you're giving it this, the bearer token that you give it to ArgoCD. It just needs read privileges on the things that it needs to deploy, and then also the child resources if you care to see it in the UI. Otherwise, it won't be able to show it. But then when it comes to actually writing or deploying to namespaces, that could be set up just through role bindings as opposed to cluster role bindings to individual namespaces that you want ArgoCD to touch. So in other words, you can give ArgoCD read privileges to the cluster, or even the other thing I'll mention is you can run ArgoCD per namespace. That's something other people do too if you only want it to manage namespace level RBAC. But yeah, so I just wanted to let people know that you can run ArgoCD in modes, in more secure modes where it doesn't have write to the whole cluster. It has read to the cluster and write to specific namespaces. We do have our built-in RBAC, which some people are a fan of, other people aren't. But the project level settings are ways to give kind of a more primitive level of permissions to namespaces. And the reason we needed to do this was Argo CD is multi-cluster to begin with, and at that time there wasn't really any multi-cluster RBAC kind of concept. So we had to build something into our tool to handle like, okay, this project can touch this namespace in cluster A, this namespace in cluster B, and this namespace in cluster C. So nothing existed like that. So that's why we have our current project model. Yeah, I'm not sure if how it might integrate with other tools, but the other feature that I really want to get eventually get done is impersonation. So in other words, rather than give ArgoCD basically keys to the king into a certain cluster, you tell it that it can impersonate a service account that you give to your developer, and then ArgoCD will have a contract with, like, when we deploy, we will impersonate this service account in order to do the things it needs to do. And that way people will use just standard Kubernetes RBAC to kind of control their permissions rather than this kind of split or this ArgoCD project model. And so I think a lot of people are excited about just using the standard mechanisms for controlling access.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks very much for explaining this, because I think a lot of the people are unaware of these things in Argo CD. The first thing like these are not exist. You need some kind of other tooling, but glad you shed some light on it and people can say it. So now I think Dan is on the very high level abstract from all of us. He is the major piece in the infrastructure. So let me ask a very quick question for the Dan. Dan, to build a platform that can offer services to thousands of customers, cloud providers have an underlying control plane that ensure the desired state of infrastructure that a customer has requested is aligned with the actual state. How does Crossplane provide a desired model of infrastructure? And this word is taken from Dan's wonderful article he wrote on the new stack. Now it's your turn, Dan.
Awesome. Yeah, great question. So, one of the things that I think in all the conversation we've already had here, that's kind of like underlying it is Kubernetes reconciliation ability, right? And the ability to say, hey, I want this workload in this state. Maybe in the Argo rollouts case, right? I want this separation of traffic between two different deployments, and I want to roll back in this manner. That doesn't happen instantly, right? You say, this is the desired state I want. And then over time, Kubernetes and the related controllers that you may be adding in there are driving you to that. So we're doing the same sort of thing with infrastructure, which is what Crossplane I think is most known for, right? And how most folks think of it. But really any external API, that's really what we're focusing on, is things that exist outside of the Kubernetes cluster. So not the pods and deployments and that sort of thing, but anything that exposes an API that you may want to bring in and represent inside your Kubernetes cluster. So infrastructure is a great use case for that. And we've talked a little bit about how these tools integrate really well together. With Crossplane, we have a system for kind of adding packages that are going to bring in the new types that represent the external API and controllers that reconcile them and kind of do that connection. And it's really interesting. You can actually have a high degree of generation of these controllers, right? Because they're doing fairly straightforward things. They're really translating from the Kubernetes API to some external, usually HTTP API. And so we add those to the cluster. And then right then you get a representation of that external thing. So I know we've mentioned an RDS instance. That's kind of like a classic one that we use for examples and things like that. And that's really great. You definitely want to be able to bring that functionality in. But at that point, you're kind of bringing in what we call high fidelity representation of that resource. So one-to-one with the external API. And if you're building a platform that's highly customized to your organization and really offers the kind of like controls you need, composition is kind of the other part of Crossplane that allows you to take those types and combine them into higher level concepts. So I like to think about kind of the evolution of AWS when we talk about this, because when you think about their earliest services, so S3, EC2, right? All of their other services have been able to build on top of that. And, a lot of the services you interact with that are higher level, something like RDS are actually running on EC2, and having that foundation has allowed them to offer these higher level abstractions that then they can give to users. That's really what we're trying to do with Crossplane as well, but allow you to choose what the level of abstraction is and change and evolve it over time. I know everyone here has worked in different sized organizations, and that the only thing that's constant is change, right? So your organization is going to scale with more folks. You're going to have new business units. You're going to bring in new vendors, which I think is especially a really interesting area to talk about. And you're going to need to change what you offer to developers. So a simple example of that, a developer may not want to configure all the fields in an RDS instance. In fact, you as a platform engineer may not want them to be able to configure all of them. You likely don't want them to. And this is where something like Kyverno can start to come in as well. But what you can say is, hey, this is just a database instance, right? The developer wants to interact with the database, maybe a MySQL or a Postgres database, right? You give some indication there. And you say to yourself, as a platform engineer, what does the developer need to be able to configure to get their job done? And I really want to give them that and nothing else. So a lot of times we'll say, hey, they need to configure the storage size within some range, right? They need to configure maybe the region it runs in, but maybe not even an AWS region, just something like our concept as an organization of East and West or something like that. And then composition allows you to take that higher level abstraction and translate it into one or more of those high fidelity resources. And we refer to those as managed resources. And this is all represented in your cluster. This is a big thing that I think is a differentiation between most infrastructure as code tools and what Crossplane is trying to do. Is we do what we call persisting the abstraction. So in a lot of infrastructure as code tools, you have your higher level interface you interact with, right? So maybe you use like a module, like a Terraform module or something like that. That gets rendered out during the apply phase, if you will, into those granular resources, and then those get created externally. But if you're trying to observe the state of the full system, unless if you're, investigating the TF state file and doing some things like that, you're not going to see that full pattern in the relationship and propagation of status from one resource to another. Whereas in Crossplane's case, we have what's called a claim, which is a namespaced representation of the higher level concept. We have what's called a composite, which is the cluster scoped representation. And so claims are bound to composites. And then you have the managed resources, and they have references that can be tracked from one to the other. Once again, using Kubernetes conventions so that that can show up in something like the ArgoCD interface and that sort of thing. We also have kind of standards, which we refer to as the XRM model, which is kind of a thin layer on top of KRM, the Kubernetes resource model, of having fields like spec and status. But we have some other concepts like for provider and at provider and that sort of thing, which also just gives you more standardization if you wanted to author one of those extensions like Jesse's talking about. Like when I was hearing you saying that, I immediately was like, oh, I need to go get one of these for some of the standardized statuses that we represent in Crossplane types. So that's kind of like the end-to-end picture of Crossplane there. And obviously organizations can adopt it and slowly over time take things off the shelf. We didn't talk about packaging too much, but we can get into that as well, which is kind of what that new stack article was focusing on. But they can kind of take things off the shelf and then modify it and evolve it over time.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And to be honest with you, like Crossplane is not an easy tool to understand. But when Dan is talking, it really shed some light on is actually what it does and how powerful it is. So yeah, thanks for the Dan to be in the community. Otherwise, some tools are really difficult to predict what they actually offer. As with the Kubernetes, you can't predict like what are the size of the problem it solves. And with tools to combine, and people figure out like where should I fit in this tool together with those as well. So I think one discussion I would try to ask, because we mentioned during the discussion, is a platform engineering, and the focus is more and more on the platform engineering. And you see the adoption of the backstage is getting momentum as cross as with ArgoCD. I think the backstage is getting momentum. What I see, like I think there people are in future, there are companies or enterprise or anyone is consuming the platform APIs to have those environment in place, and then tools like Kyverno, ArgoCD can work with the policy enforcement, like this environment shouldn't be created unless it's requested from SIME, and this requirement always been created because this is not have any problem with it. And plus Argo CD can sync those states between different platform APIs and then do the pull operation and make it available to the production. So there are some of the wonderful talks on the KubeCon associated with it. But I will go to Jesse and then Jim and then Dan to let's figure out how the platform engineering look like or right now and what's going to be happening in moving forward. Jesse, first from you. Jesse, are you muted?
Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, so you mentioned Backstage, and so although I haven't used Backstage, I completely understand and I know why it's so popular. Like I think when we one of the big teams that as part of our sister team was actually a developer portal experience. So basically this portal where you can onboard like a new service and just kind of get all this stuff out of the box. And that I think developer experience is something still always continuously needs to be improved with Kubernetes, and I think that's people are starting to move on to that stage, right? With earlier, I think it was a lot of more um, kind of just making Kubernetes ease of use um, and just on the infrastructure trying to migrate and security stuff. But more and more as people adopt it, they're finding Kubernetes just harder to use. Like, where's the next level stuff that we have to layer on top? So Kubernetes is part of it. How does it integrate with our existing um, uh, internal tools and stuff? So um, like I mentioned, we had a sister team whose sole focus was to build this in-house thing, and like I think Backstage could essentially like kind of replace or replicate what we were doing there. So I would say that developer experience is still an unsolved problem with Kubernetes, and I think projects around there are going to continue to be to pop up, including stuff that we want to do ourselves at Acuity.
Yes, absolutely. And Jim, like what you want to add in here, because developer experience is what is I think right now is missing piece. And how do you combine with developer experience and what the platform need and what the organization constraints or requirements are? How when those three things combine, how what the world look like?
Yeah, and so it really depends on the type of organization and what its goals are and what folks are trying to achieve, right? Because I don't think there's a one size fits all. So what might work for a large organization with thousands of developers is not necessarily the best
Mhm.
solution for a development team of 20, right? So, and I would also kind of, put forward the idea that you can have a very elegant developer experience directly from a CLI, right? So, and developers, we're quite comfortable using command line tools and several other tools. So that's complexity is not, necessarily a problem if you're solving complex things with it, right? So I think to me, once understanding what the organization is trying to achieve, and then is platform engineering really required, or is there are there some lighter weight guardrails that can be put into place to make sure that the as developers are using any form of secure self-service, right? So let's take a very simple example. So if I have a team of 20 and you have, a dev test cluster and maybe you have a staging and a production cluster, once you set up those clusters, you want to give developers access to it. You should still be using, of course, the best practices for security, governance, but maybe at that point, shared clusters and using something like namespaces as a service is good enough, right? So you don't need necessarily a full catalog like Backstage and other things on top. And maybe you can kind of, those set of lighter weight tools with some command line, interfaces, but with the proper guardrails, right? So you certainly don't want to give everybody cluster admin access and say, do whatever you want. You want to put in the best practices. You want to manage most of your deployments and rollouts, or all of them, through things like GitOps. Any access to cloud systems you want to also treat as infrastructure as code. So all of the same patterns apply, but the end deliverable, if you want to call it a platform or this composition of tools, may look very different, right? Now if you say, okay, that 20-person company becomes, or organization becomes, a 20,000 person organization, very different requirements, right? And very different approach in terms of how you're going to solve these problems. The same concepts apply, but you really need a very, a much stricter set of guardrails. You're most likely going to offer clusters as a service at that point. So you're not only spinning up things like RDS, but you're spinning up entire self-service, secure self-service clusters, right? So, and this could be on demand, again, driven through the same concepts, like GitOps, like, Crossplane for IAC and Kyverno for governance and policies, but you would approach the problem very differently, right? So it really comes down to gauging again what the team or the organization is trying to achieve and right sizing. But I think the common ingredients and common patterns, having those building blocks is really invaluable to platform teams as they're building these type of systems.
Yeah, I like that.
Thanks, Jim.
Oh,
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead,
okay.
Dan.
I was just gonna jump in because I feel like that's such a good illustration of kind of like what it looks like for an organization to evolve. One of the biggest use cases we actually see for Crossplane is having kind of like a central control plane and provisioning other clusters with whatever they view as like the fundamental services there. And teams actually interact with those provisioned clusters, right? What we usually refer to them as like app clusters or something like that. And maybe, you know, from that central control plane, maybe they're installing Crossplane into each of the app clusters they bring up with a set of packages that offer, you know, like the database claim and that sort of thing. Maybe they also put ArgoCD in there, and that's actually what developers have access to, right? And that's how they interact with it. And then they, you know, bring their policy along. And all of that actually can be packaged up into a concept of a cluster that, you know, has, let's say you're let's switch up our cloud provider. Let's say you're doing a GKE cluster, right? And you're provisioning app clusters on GKE. You might say, okay, I need to have in my central control plane provider GCP installed, right? To be able to get those GCP types. I need to have provider Helm installed and maybe provider Kubernetes. And when we're talking about external APIs, that external API might be another Kubernetes cluster, right? Or both of those are true for provider Kubernetes and provider Helm. So we have a lot of examples of folks taking a GKE cluster and then having the kube config from that be piped into provider Helm and provider Kubernetes. And so when you create a cluster, right, it's creating the physical cluster and the node groups and, you know, whatever roles and things for the cloud provider are necessary, maybe some networking bits as well. And then putting in Kyverno, installing it in, right? Installing ArgoCD and having kind of like one abstraction to create what they view as like a standard developer cluster in their organization. And then, as we're talking about, right, that definition can evolve over time and grow to support different use cases.
Yes, absolutely. I think I would like to see like these two combine in, because there's certainly a need, because when you first time install Kubernetes, any one of us, like, you see there's a need. If you install Kubernetes for the first time, you see your app is not accessible from the outside world. What should I do? You need to install Ingress. And Kubernetes is a wonderful model, like you bring in what you need from the community, and community has a huge support, and every tool is now a community pop, has their own community. So evolving or addition or use cases or adoption is actually right now is very simple and easy as well. So before I let you go, I will start see the adoption of Argo CD as of today, and why do see in the GitOps race Argo being the winner in this category, I think in 2022, to be honest.
Yeah. So I hate to describe as winners, but I can describe how I can describe why it's so popular. So if you talk about GitOps, right? Everyone loves Kubernetes, declarative APIs, and continuous reconciliation. Infrastructure as code existed before that, but really Kubernetes really kind of up-leveled that to another level. But this big consequence of declarative APIs is just that specification just is grow, and so you have to build these knobs for every little feature that gets introduced in the API, and you end up with these massive YAMLs that are just have to be stored in Git. Like, if not Git, where else are you going to store these YAMLs? So GitOps is almost a necessity at that point. But on top of that, GitOps gives you just so much more benefits, like who changed this, who made this change. Like, you get the audit, you get built-in change control mechanisms through the Git provider, like pull requests. You can do detect drift, so you can see what's running in the cluster and what's supposed to be running and compare that. And then you get the familiarity with the tooling because developers already know how to use Git. So that's why GitOps took off and why it's so popular. But in terms of why ArgoCD also became popular is when we built it, we knew that we have to develop for people who didn't understand Kubernetes, and so the user interface is something we really spent a lot of effort and energy on because this is something we expected people to be visiting on a day-to-day basis. And I like to say that we built it almost as like a teaching tool for developers so they understand the relationships between Kubernetes parent and child resources. I myself learned about these relationships just after having built Argo CD. I was like, oh, I didn't realize these endpoints and services were so connected, even though they didn't have like a child resource. So we had to those type of things people discover after using Argo CD. And so I think for us, we always tried to put ourselves in the shoes of someone who is not totally familiar with Kubernetes and try to tailor for that experience.
Yes, and I'm going back to the gym again and asking the same question. Like you see Kyverno being incubated project. Soon we see might be the CNCF graduated project. So as you see the adopters, the vendors, the end user, the community, I think it's when it started, I didn't see a decrease in Kyverno love from the community and adoption from the community. You see every day somebody is pulling the Kyverno images from the Docker Hub. So there is so much in the stack. So one thing I think we all agree, like Kyverno, you don't need to learn any new language. That's a main big advantage. Apart from that, why do you see people jumping into the Kyverno on these days? And what are the different tools they can use, leveraging the Kyverno to solve the bigger problems?
Yeah, so like any tool, I mean, Kyverno is a means to an end, right? I mean, nobody wakes up any day and said, "Let me write more policies today," or anything like that. You're trying to solve a problem, and you're looking for the most elegant way to solve the problem. And I like what Jesse said, right? I feel users and all of us are always perpetual beginners, right? We're always, look, every time you go to Kubernetes, even if you've used it 100 times before, or every time you write code, you have to kind of, assume that you want to do it again. You might not remember all the context or all the background, and you want to reveal that complexity incrementally to users, right? So that approach and the focus on Kubernetes, right? So Kyverno is not a general purpose policy engine. It's focused on Kubernetes, which lets it do some very smart things in an elegant fashion, which you cannot do if you were trying to solve a different set of problems by creating a policy language or a general purpose policy tool. A good example is how Kyverno does pod security admission. It's a very simple construct, but leverages the upstream Kubernetes built-in libraries, things like that, which you cannot again do if you're writing a general purpose policy engine, right? So there's a trade-off, and our focus has been Kubernetes, and we believe Kubernetes is no longer just about applications, right? Like you see with Crossplane and other things, Kubernetes it has become that universal scheduler, has become that common control plane for everything, and that's why we feel the use cases and the types of things that Kyverno can solve for security and automation will just continue to grow.
Yes, absolutely. And Dan, because you're all of us, you are the on the bigger abstraction from the rest of us. Like, what do you see? What do you see the bare? What do you see the bare minimum the platform team should?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I caught the whole question there. But I think the big thing for me is, over the next few months and years, building out this kind of like ecosystem of good starter points for folks, and good like prepackaged solutions that platform teams, whether you're at a bigger or small company, right, can get started with off the shelf, so that they can be seeing value really quickly, and integrating new tooling and that sort of thing. I think being able to do that is going to enable them to then evolve and grow their platform to meet new use cases that come up. I mentioned the Crossplane packages earlier. The way those work is they kind of like establish dependencies. So we have a graph of dependencies and resolve those and that sort of thing, which means that you can, have a composition package which maps these abstractions and depend on provider AWS. And that means when someone installs that package, that Crossplane is going to make sure provider AWS and all of its types are present and ready to go. And similarly, you can take a composition package off the shelf, or a configuration package, which includes composition, and make that a dependency of another configuration package. And what that allows you to do is say, hey, let's say that Acuity, for instance, has an internal platform for some SaaS product they offer, and they have like this Heroku-like experience for developers. I mean, it's really great. And they say, hey, this is the way to build a platform. We want to open source this, or we want to open source some components of it for the community, and we'll iterate on it and develop it over time. I can come in as, a new startup or a new company and say, hey, I know Acuity has really solid track record of delivering some top level products. They must have a really good developer platform. I'm going to actually just take their developer platform that they use internally off the shelf and start from there, some pieces of it. And then over time, some of that is obviously not going to fit my organization. And so I'm going to change some bits out, or I'm going to maybe even take their abstraction and put another abstraction on top of it. That's something we see pretty often with some of our cluster abstraction packages, where folks will say, hey, maybe I want to create a cluster and a database at the same time. And actually, as a platform builder, I get to experience the benefits of the abstraction as well. And I may present something even higher level to my developers. We've seen some really cool examples of that with something like a function, where it could be backed by a Lambda function, or it could be backed by a Knative function in the cluster, or it could be backed by like spinning up an EC2 instance and running like a bash script on it, right? Like there's all sorts of ways you can implement this at differing levels of abstraction. And being able to take things off the shelf and mix and match allows you to see that value a lot quicker. So I think we lost them again. Yeah. I can, I guess, play my role of host, surprise host. It looks like we're pretty much at the end of time here. Definitely enjoyed being here with y'all. I'm big fans of both of your projects. And I'll speak on behalf of Siam that thank you for taking the time to be here. And I'm sure we'll have some more shows in the future. Oh, he's back. We'll let him end it. We were just wrapping up.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's the power of two. That's a high availability show.
It was a failover.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you very much, Jesse. This is the first time you're being on the show as well. I will be keep in touch with you in the future as well. Jim is always being present on the show, always sharing wonderful insights on Kyverno. And Dan is always been a learning resource for me on the Crossplane. Otherwise, the Crossplane looks very difficult to learn. So thank you very much all for sharing your knowledge and for what the work you have done. Is the most demanding open source projects people is right now I am gathered by. So looking forward to meeting you again in the future, and looking forward to your projects, all your work you have done for the open source side and the enterprise side. So please keep in touch with the community. Thank you very much. Stay safe, stay healthy. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, folks.